Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. It's a distinct pleasure that we're able to present this wonderful book by Santiago Levy, Under-Rewarded Efforts, The Elusive Quest for Prosperity in Mexico. We will be having a presentation of the book and then a discussion involving our panelists. But first of all, I'd just like to open the floor for a very dear friend of ours, Bosco Martí, who will be just talking a little bit, giving a sort of an official introduction to Santiago and to this book. Bosco, welcome, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Really appreciate the opportunity of being here at the Wilson Center and the Mexico Institute that has always been tackling the key issues of the bilateral agenda, and certainly in this case, a very important book that comes at a very timely moment. It's a great honor for me to present Santiago Levy, thanks to whom the Inter-American Development Bank is now recognized as Latin America's most prestigious knowledge bank, giving the outstanding job that Santiago has done as Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge, and previously as Chief Economist. I don't know if you know, but Santiago has brought on board more than 100 PhDs to the bank. And these are great people that certainly provide great policy advice to the region, and under his leadership had done a great work. As you all know, before joining the bank, Santiago had a very successful career in the Mexican government, where he served as General Director for the Mexican Social Security Institute, IMSS, from December 2000 to October 2005, where I had the privilege to meet him and work together on the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. From 94 to 2000, he served as Deputy Minister of Finance and Public Credit of Mexico, becoming certainly the main architect of the renowned social program Progresa Oportunidades, that benefits the poor and has been a key reference for cash transfer models throughout the world. As Danny Roderick states, this was an innovative, incentive-based program that was novel in the time. In 1997, it replaced inefficient price subsidies with direct cash grants to poor families as long as their children were kept in school and received periodic health checks. As you all know, he holds a PhD and a master's in political economy from Boston University. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Cambridge University, and he has been a great advisor for several governments and international organizations and has held several teaching positions, including faculty positions at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo of Mexico and Boston University, where he was associate professor. He's the author of at least 80 articles, monographs, and books, chapters on such diverse subjects as poverty reduction, competitiveness, foreign exchange policy, export imbalance pricing, microeconomics, and energy. Now I would like to talk a little bit about his most recent publication that we will be discussing today on the rewarded efforts, the elusive quest of prosperity in Mexico, that has already become a bestseller with more than 35,000 downloads and has been quoted in dozens of publications in Mexico and internationally, including The Economist, the Financial Times, and El País. In his book, Santiago talks about the paradoxes of Mexico's economic performance. He recognizes that in the last 2 decades, macroeconomic management was flawless, overall sound and effective, and while there may be many reasons why Mexico's growth was disappointed, deficient macroeconomic management is certainly not one of them. Fiscal and monetary policy have ensured a stable macroeconomy, and investors' perception of risk in Mexico are among the lowest in Latin America. The country has made major strides in social progress. School attendance has increased. Education quality has improved, and no country has tried harder to integrate into the world economy with open trade. And yet, overall productivity, the gains have been small. Since 1996, Mexico economy has expanded at barely over 1% per year in per capita terms, and labor productivity has grown less than 0.5%. The reason is at a micro level, according to Santiago. Santiago points his finger to misallocation of resources as the culprit of Mexico's poor productivity. As the Financial Times rightly state, Santiago did a very rigorous data analysis by examining census, where he found that 47% of the low productivity companies operating in Mexico in 2008 were still functioning in 2003, but 43% of highly productive enterprise had gone out of business. The incentives for business to remain small and operate in the informal sector also meant increasing investment in education to turn out higher skilled workers had been wasted. In his analysis, Santiago found that university graduate salaries were falling relatively to those of workers with only primary or high school education. We can synthesize all this in 5 points, if I may. Number one, macroeconomic management has been effective. Number two, the foreign trade regime has been appropriate. Number three, there is more and better human capital. Number four, investment rate is higher. Number five, there have been many efforts to increase efficiencies. Thus, superficially, the problem is productivity. The central hypothesis of the book is that it is due to large and persistent misallocations of resources productivity. Growth has stagnated in Mexico, and in turn, growth has been disappointingly low. Santiago states that it is very important that the first points continue to be pursued, and that the most effective route to raise productivity and accelerate growth in Mexico is to reform the main policies and institutions that stand behind misallocation. He proposes that there needs to be a policy shift to give the highest priority to substantively redesign Mexico's tax, social insurance, labor, and protection system, and to strengthen the country's judicial institutions, with double objective of improving social protection and aligning workers and firms' incentives in the direction of higher productivity. As The Economist states in its article about Santiago's book, the policy changes are politically daunting, but the new president certainly has a strong mandate that will allow the new administration to tackle some of these challenges. With this, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to present you Santiago Levy. Muchas gracias, doctor.
The floor is yours. Please.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Bosco, for the nice words, and particularly thank you to Duncan Wood and to the Woodrow Wilson Center for this opportunity to share this book with you. And I also want to thank Inés Bustillo and Bill Maloney, who I ruined their weekend asking them to be commentators, but the only thing that cleans my conscience is that it was raining all the time, so it wasn't so bad. And you had to read something because you couldn't go out bicycling or something like that. Thank you all for being here. What I'd like to do is in about 20 minutes or so, sort of the main ideas of what's in this book, and then probably give a chance to Inés and to Bill to give their thoughts, and then pass it over to Duncan and let him run the show. So a little bit of what motivates this book is really what, for the last 20 years, has been the central question of many, many economists in Mexico, which is, if you look at the list of the check marks there, this is the poster child of the Washington Consensus. Right? No economy in Latin America has done things as right as Mexico has done. And the puzzle is that if you take away Venezuela, we're the country that has grown the least in Latin America over the last 2 decades. So that's, the real question is why is the case? And if you do the things that economists like to do, which is to ask, growth comes from accumulation of capital, accumulation of labor, accumulation of education, and productivity. If you do the standard decompositions, what you will find is that superficially, the reason that Mexico hasn't grown is because productivity hasn't grown. And if you look at a graph for productivity in Mexico over the last 2 decades, is about as sad as it could be. It's just like a flat line. So then the next question is, how come people who are increasingly educated, because there have been large gains in human capital in Mexico, that have macroeconomic stability, that are bordered with the United States, that have access to the largest market in the world, and that have stability, why can't they be more productive? Why can't productivity grow in such a country? So this is a book about productivity, but in the end, you'll see this is a book about a political economy that is extremely complex and about an ideology that is extremely entrenched, which is behind Mexico's real problem. What I do in the book is, the book sort of has 2 parts, is a lot of data work in terms of understanding what is going on, and then an effort and interpretation of what is going on. So the first part of the book is really, hopefully, not very controversial. It just takes data that I've sit there and then sort of works the data very, very carefully. It took me 5 years to make this book, because there's a lot of data. There's a lot of data that's worked. And to just give you a sense of the data that is back here, I asked myself the question, what is it about Mexican firms? What is it about Mexican firms that they can be more productive? What is happening to Mexican firms? And I have access to this gold mine. This gold mine is the Mexican census. So by Latin American standards, this is probably one of the largest, most complete data sources of firms. And so the last number, just look at 2013. I have data for 4 million firms. And these firms are grouped together in very, very detailed, what economists call 6-digit sectors, right? So all firms that produce shirts is one sector. All firms that produce pasta for soups is another sector. I know for a fact that there are 745 firms in Mexico that produce pasta for soups. Kind of a nerdish thing, right? But I know that. And there are 453 firms in Mexico that produce shirts for men. So I know everything about each of these firms. I know their capital stock, I know the number of workers, I know their wage bill, I know their intermediate inputs, their value added. I have this huge data set, and I have the same data set for 1998, 2003, 2008, and 2013. So I have a película, I have a view of what is happening with Mexican firms, and this is the data set that I exploit. And to just give you a sense of what the data looks like, I use finer categories of firms in the book, but it would be unfair to you to give you all these categories and ask you to hold them in your head. So broadly, this is not quite accurate, this is not quite correct, but broadly, think of firms in Mexico as being formal, as being, or being informal, broadly. So the first 2 columns here, does this work?
I don't think it works on there.
Right. So let me do this. The first 2 columns here, these are formal firms, these are informal firms. These are shares, so they add up to 100%. And these are firms by size, 1 to 5 workers, 6 to 10, 11 to 50, 51 or more. So what is first interesting fact is, of all firms in Mexico, 92% of firms have between 1 and 5 workers, 92% of firms. And in Mexico, less than 1% of all firms have more than 50 workers. So this is a country with a lot of very, very many tiny firms. As a matter of fact, these data underestimates the problem for something that sounds nerdish but is important. The census only classifies as a firm something that has a ceiling and that has walls. If there's economic activity in the streets, it's not picked up by the census. And you'll be surprised about the following number. The census only captures about 45% of employment in Mexico. A lot of people out there in the streets, in firms that are not in this data. Firms in Mexico are actually smaller than what is shown by this data. If you look at where are workers in Mexico, more than half of employment is in informal firms. And we tend to think of the informal firms as having very little capital. And that might be true, but when you add them up, because there are a lot of them, 42% of the capital stock in Mexico is in informal firms. So there's a lot of investment in informal firms. People put their savings and they invest in informal firms. And this is a picture of the way firms look in Mexico according to the 2013 census. If I look at the 98 census, 2003, 2008, 2013, I can look at La Película. And what happened over the last 20 years, NAFTA and all, stabilization and all, is that the average size of a firm fell. The informality of firms increased from 83% to 90% of all firms. And a lot of capital was devoted into informal firms. And a lot of labor was hired in informal firms. These are just descriptive statistics. I'm not telling you why. This is just numbers coming out from the census. The next thing I do in the book is I ask, all right, so some firms are small and some firms are informal, so who cares? What we really care is how productive are firms. And what I do is I compute for each firm in all the 4 censuses, this is about 12 million computations. For each firm, I compute an index of productivity of that firm. I don't go into the technical details. The book sketches it. None of this is my theory. This is papers from somebody else. I'm simply applying methodologies developed by other people to the Mexican data. I compute one index of productivity for each firm. And then I compare firms to get a sense of how productive they are. So think of the 745 firms in Mexico that produce shirts. Think of investing 1 peso of capital and labor in a firm producing shirts, firm A, or producing also investing 1 peso of capital and labor in a different firm producing shirts. In a reasonably functioning market economy, the productivity of the peso in this firm and that firm should not be very, very different. Ideally, they should be the same. 1 peso of capital and labor producing shirts here, and here should be the same. This is a comparison in the United States of the differences in productivity in the manufacturing sector. This is the average productivity of firms producing shirts. The same is for shirts producing chairs, the same for firms producing glasses of water. In the United States, the most productive firm is about 16 times more productive than the average firm. And the least productive firm is about 1/16 less productive than the average firm. So the United States is also not a perfect economy. Right? You would have expected this to be very, very narrow, but that's about it. This is Mexico. In Mexico, the most productive firm is about 64 times more productive than the average firm, and the least productive firm is 1/1000 less productive than the average firm. So the basic punchline from this message is that the differences in productivity in firms are much larger in Mexico than the United States. Actually, when I can compare data with other countries of Latin America, for the parts that is comparable, the difference in productivity are also much larger in Mexico than in comparable data of the United States. And of course, every economist in his own head will ask the question, how come firms of such different productivities survive in the market? That's part 2. All I'm doing here is documenting that there's a lot of inefficiency in Mexican firms. And then I repeat the calculation. Blue is 1998, red is 2013. So I asked myself the question, what happened between 1998 and 2013? Remember that 1 is median productivity, so the ones that are there are the high productivity firms, and the ones that are here are the low productivity firms. Inside the blue, there are about 2 million firms. Inside the red, there are about 4 million firms. A lot of, and every firm is a dot. And then you put all the dots together and you get these curves, and people that are nerdish like me get very, very excited when they look at these curves. because this is a picture about what happened to all firms in Mexico over the last 15 years, all in one graph. Fantastico, no? All in one graph. So what does it say? Look at this part over here, and if you look parts over here, you're very happy, because the red is 2013, the blue is 1998. So what it says here is that there are more firms in Mexico in 2013 than in 1998 that have productivity above the average. You know, these come out in the pictures of, you know, the expansion and all the business reviews, and, you know, the businessmen, you know, look like that, and right? And we think of NAFTA, and we think of auto parts, and we think of all the firms. And yes, there is a mass of firms in Mexico that over the last 15 years have done very well. But then if you look at this part over here, what you see is that there are also more firms in Mexico in 2013 that are doing less well compared to 1998. And without going through all the numbers here, what I do in the book is I ask myself the question, how much capital and labor went to the high productivity firms, and how much capital and labor went to the low productivity firms? And the bad news is that the low productivity firms attracted more capital and labor than the high productivity firms. So that these guys pull the average up, right? They make us look like Korea. But these guys pull the average down. They make us look like Ghana. And the guys that make us look like Ghana are attracting more capital and labor than the guys that make us look like Korea. The average of all that is basically zero. And productivity growth in the country has stagnated. Stylized facts, just data. The census has a very nice feature as well, that the last two censuses, the INEGI, the Mexican Statistical Institute, did something fantastic. What they did is they put to each firm an individual number so that you could identify the firm in the 2008 census and exactly the same firm in the 2013 census. And I can see how many workers it had and what happened to its capital and its labor. It's an exact panel. And I can know various things. If I see a firm in the 2008 census, but I don't see it in the 2013 census, the firm must have died. It exited the market. It died. It went bankrupt. Something happened. It died. If I see the firm in the 2008 census, and I also see it in the 2013 census, it survived, because it's in both censuses. If I don't see it in the 2008 census, but I see it in the 2013 census, is a new firm. It entered during the period. So I can see firms that entered, exited, and survived. And then I ask questions. I do graphs like the ones that I did before. I'm not going to show them because there's no lack of time. But what happens is that what I find is that many low productivity firms survive. And sadly, many high productivity firms die. So firms that are here die, firms that are here survive, and it is exactly what we were expecting. I also see that new firms that come in with a lower productivity than firms that were already in the market. So there are firms in the market producing suits. New firms come into the market to produce suits, but those new firms have less productivity than the firms that were already in the market. And in your question, you say, oh, this is kind of a waste, right? It would have been much better if the capital and labor put into the new firm producing suits would go to make the firm that's more productive grow. But what I see is they see very little growth of firms. Mexican firms, when they survive, they tend not to grow. And there's a lot of firm churning. Many firms enter, die, and new firms are created. There's a huge amount of firm churning. I can see that from the data. A really amazing data is the following. In 2013, there were 4 million firms in the census. 50% of those were not in the census 5 years before. They create it, but then they die, but then a new firm is created, and then they dies, and then a new firm is created, and then, but the firms that are coming in are on average no better than the firms that are leaving, and that's why productivity on average is not increasing. So huge amount of churning, a huge amount of waste of capital resources and labor resources. And think of it from the labor point of view. On the labor side, a lot of workers are losing their jobs in productive firms, and a lot of workers are getting jobs in low productivity firms. And there's a lot of churning of workers associated with the churning of firms. This is all from the data. The next thing I do in the book is I say, look, Mexico accumulated a huge amount of human capital during this period. Is this productivity problem, is this dysfunctional firm dynamics a result of the fact that there's not enough human capital? We hear a lot about, skills mismatch and this and that, right? So what I document in the book is that Mexico's educational effort over the last 15 years was higher than the average of the Latin American countries. Other countries did, individual countries did a bigger effort than Mexico. But Mexico is more than the average of Latin American countries. And I also dig in all the information that we have about the quality of education. And it is true that the quality of education in Mexico compared to Korea or compared to Singapore is low by the usual standard PISA indicators and whatnot. But it is also true that if you look at the indicators 15 years ago and the indicators today, they're pointing in the upward direction. And if you look at the national indicators of quality, Enlace, or at the UNESCO indicators of quality, CERCE, segundo examen, tercer examen, the data that there is says that the quality of education in Mexico, yes, low by OECD standards, has been improving, and the educational years of the labor force has also been improving. I provide data about the number of people who have university and high school degrees compared to people with primary degrees. So what has happened is clearly there's been an increase in human capital, but the increase in human capital has meant nothing for productivity. We tend to associate in our heads more investments in human capital are going to translate immediately into higher productivity, and what this book is showing is maybe, but maybe not. And in the particular case in Mexico, it was actually not. We accumulated human capital, but it did not turn into higher productivity. In fact, I don't see any evidence in the data that there's a systematic shortage of high-skilled labor in Mexico. And one way of looking at the data is, suppose you say, look, there are a lot of low-quality universities, a lot of low-quality schools out there, blah, 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 Universidades Patito. All right, that may be so. I do the following calculation. I say, if the really, really top guys are very, very scarce, not the median guy, but the really, really top guys, then their wages should be going up. The graduates of the very best universities, of the Harvards and Yales and MITs of Mexico. So I look at the wage distribution in 1996, I look at the wage distribution in 2015, and I look at the top 10%, top 5%, top 2%, top 1%, the very, very top people. Their wages in 2015 are the same as their wages in 1996. There's really no evidence that firms out there are competing for talent. Of course, there's always the anecdote that in Querétaro, a Canadian firm that set up and was trying to do aeronautical parts didn't find engineers. Yes, true. But that's not a big enough phenomenon to really affect the dynamics of productivity for the country as a whole. In fact, what is happening in Mexico is that returns to education are actually coming down. This is the difference between people with an incomplete primary degree and a university degree. In 1996, they made about 120% more on average. In 2015, they only make about 80% more. So it doesn't square a scarcity of human capital story with falling returns to education. There are also falling returns to experience. I don't go into here because it's too much data. So let me close this part of the presentation. Sort of what does the data say? And what the data says is, look, Mexico's channeling too many resources to informal firms. This is a mostly legal phenomenon. The laws in Mexico allow some firms to be informal, depending on the contract that they give their worker, and that's perfectly legal. Most informality in Mexico is legal. This is not a problem about breaking the laws. This is a problem about badly designed laws. The second problem is that economic activity is very dispersed. A lot of very, very small, tiny firms, a lot of people self-employed. The third problem is that Schumpeter never set a foot in Mexico. The notion that, the good firms, creative destruction and all that, not happening. And then the fourth news is that, yes, we reformed the financial system, and we reformed the pension system, and we reformed this, and we reformed that. But despite all this reform, the bottom line of all these reforms is that productivity stagnated. And that's why it's the title of the book. Everybody did a lot. Everybody worked very hard. Everybody invested in education. Policymakers did a lot of reforms. The investment rate went up, but everybody's efforts were under reward. So that's part of the book, and it's sort of those kind of the facts. The next part of the book is, all right, now the challenge is understand the forces in Mexico that continuously push resources in the direction of informal firms. Understand the forces in Mexico that impede productive firms from growing. Understand the forces in Mexico that impede workers with high human capital getting jobs in good firms, and therefore having their wages relative to workers with low skills falling through time. That is the second part of the challenge. And I've got to ask for, I couldn't enter the PDF to change this into English for some reason, and I just left my job at the IDB, and I was at home this morning, and I'm now unemployed, and I don't have an assistant, and I don't know how to correct this, and I apologize, and I've got to learn how to use my computer. And so this is in Spanish.
Next time, send it to us.
I need somebody to help me get into a file that I can't get into a file, so I couldn't do it. Anyway, what I do in the book is I say, look, Mexicans are not idiots. They're not lazy either. By the way, they're the second hardest set of workers in the OECD data by the number of hours. So if they're not idiots, if they work hard and they're increasingly educated, what is making them make the decisions that we see in the data? Why do they always create small firms? Why don't they put the capital to make firms grow? And why do they go to the informal sector? And why do they work on their own? So I look at the labor regulations, the tax regulations, and the regulations of markets in Mexico, and I say there's a set of forces in the labor, in the tax, and in the market regulation that are inducing workers to generate the outcomes that I observe in the data, that I observe in the census data. So the next task is to understand what happens here, here, and here. So since I don't have a lot of time, just give you a flavor of what's in chapter 7 of the book. But what chapter 7 of the book says, look, Mexico has a dysfunctional welfare state. Mexico only has social insurance for workers who have a particular contract with a firm, a salaried contract. For workers that have a different contract with a firm, a non-salaried contract, the social insurance works differently. For the first set of guys, you've got to pay for it. The firm has to pay for it, or the worker has to pay for it. For the second set of guys, they get it for free. So the social insurance regulation is de facto telling firms, it behooves you not to have salaried workers, at least not legally, because if you have a legal salaried worker, you're going to have to pay 30% of the wage for his housing and his health and his pension and his daycare, blah, blah, blah. However, if you hire him illegally, the government will give him for free his health insurance and his pension. And so the entrepreneur says, ¿qué que no entendí muy bien? Sí, sí, sí. If you hire him legally, you have to pay 30% of his wage for his pension and his health insurance. But if you break the law, we'll give it to him for free. This is written in the laws in Mexico, in various pieces of the law. And by the way, If you give him a salaried contract, you can't fire him. Unless, of course, he walks naked into the factory or he's drunk. But if output goes down or there's technical change, you can't fire him. But if you don't give him a salaried contract, you can do whatever you want, because he's not your employee, legally speaking. So starting with Article 123 of Mexico's Constitution, down Mexico's federal labor law, down Mexico's social insurance regulations, and down Mexico's regulations for the parallel welfare state, what we have created is very strong incentives that tell firms, have non-salaried contracts or be illegal. Of course, to be illegal, you got to be small, because if you're big, they catch you. And the non-salaried firm, is difficult for the firm to be big because you can't organize production when there's no wage labor inside the firm. So you tend to stay very small. The typical firm in Mexico is actually a firm with non-salaried labor, with about 3 workers, in which most workers are actually related to each other. El papá, la mamá, y el primo. And the firm works through rent sharing or through cultural norms, not wages, because wages are very, very highly taxed. And then if you come here, if you weren't dead by then, this will ensure that you're actually dead. Because what the tax legislation will say is, if you hire salaried workers, you must withhold the income taxes. But if you don't hire a salaried worker, the guy has to pay on his own. So Mexico is the country in Latin America with the highest ratio of income taxes of salaried workers to GDP of any place in Latin America. And then the tax law says the following to firms. If the firm sells less than $100,000 a year, the tax rate on the firm is 2% of sales. If the firm sells more than $100,000 a year, 2 millones de pesos, the tax rate on the firm is 30% of profits. So now think of a firm who sells 1,999,999 pesos. In la orillita, right at the edge of the legislation, paying 2% of taxes. All this is legal. And now a new client comes to the firm and says, I like your product, I like your shirts, I'd like to buy more shirts from you. And the guy says, no way. Because if I sell 2,000,001 peso, I'm gonna have to pay 30% of my taxes of my profits in taxes. I'm gonna make less money. And I show data in the book that in fact, this is a systemic problem, that it affects a very large number of firms, and the incentives not to grow are very high. I also discussed the value-added tax. I'm not gonna go into here. Mexico's value-added tax is a disaster from the point of view of productivity. And then finally, I look at issues having to do with the judicial system of the country. And one other reason why firms stay small in Mexico is because enforcing contracts in Mexico is very difficult. The judicial system doesn't work very well. So bringing in shareholders into the firm is complicated if shareholders' rights are not going to be respected. So it's difficult to disentangle this, and I don't do it in the book, and the techniques to do them are work in progress, but all of them together are consistent with the data that I was showing you before. And all this, in chapter 8 I show, worsened between 1998 and 2013. Yes, well, we were, touting NAFTA, and we were, saying that, we're the poster child of the IMF, and we have a large primary surplus and all that. All that was getting worse. I know you don't go through all these numbers, but basically all these incentives were going badly. So how do I think of Mexico? Let me remind you who's Penelope. Remember in Homer's poem, The Odyssey? Ulysses had just won the war in Troya, and he was going back to his wife Penelope, and of course he took a long detour and saw the sirens and all that. And Penelope was there, she was the queen, and there were all these suitors who wanted to marry Penelope, and they said, look, Ulysses is probably dead in Troy, so you've got to marry one of us. And Penelope was trying to buy time, and she said, yeah, I'll marry one of you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to knit this chambrita, this whatever, shawl, and when I finish knitting the shawl, I will decide who I will marry. And what Penelope would do is during the day she would knit, and during the night she wouldn't knit. So in Mexico, during the day, we signed free trade agreements We do big efforts to promote direct foreign investment. We make financial and sector reforms. We invest in training programs. We invest in research and development. And then during the night, we ensure that the fiscal institutions of the country generate all the incentives to stay small and to violate the law, that the social insurance institutions of the country say, stay small, get non-salaried labor, be illegal, that the judicial institutions of the country say, don't trust the courts, don't have other shareholders, don't attract other capital, and that the labor institutions say, don't hire salaried workers because you ain't going to be able to fire them. And all this worsened over the last 15 years as the country was pursuing social inclusion as a way of extending benefits to many workers. Of course, I'm being facetious here. The expansion of all these social insurance programs for non-salaried workers and for informal workers in the minds of most people, including institutions that are 5 or 10 blocks from here, was perfectly justified, and rightly so, because there are many workers out there without pensions, or without daycare, or without or without health. But what that is doing from the point of view of productivity is it's saying, let's subsidize the unproductive part of the economy, let's subsidize the informal sector, let's subsidize informal employment, and let's punish formal employment. So this is my Mickey Mouse view of what has happened in Mexico over the last. This is the mantra. Everybody wants growth with social inclusion, right? It's in the speech of every IMF head, every World Bank head, everybody wants growth with social inclusion. Every president's speech talks about social growth and inclusion. The central thesis of the book is that in Mexico's current legal and institutional context, we will never get growth with social inclusion. We haven't gotten it for the last 2 decades, and under the current structure, we will not get it. Mexico was able to grow fast without social inclusion in the 60s and the 70s. All that crashed. And since the 90s, what we have tried to do is to enhance social inclusion through many poverty programs, health programs, pension programs, while maintaining institutions about severance pay and about labor institutions and judicial from way, way back, literally from the beginning of the 20th century. We have superimposed 2 welfare states with regulations on labor and severance pay that are very, very old, and with a tax system that tries to redistribute through exceptions to the value-added tax, through a tax system that tries to promote small enterprises because that's the way you promote employment, but that in effect is only subsidizing the informal sector of the economy. What Mexico would like to do is do that. What has happened in Mexico is that, yes, we increase the coverage of many, many things. Any report of any multilateral will show numbers about all these things improving, but we grow the least of all countries in Latin America, except for Venezuela, and so we have moved here. How long is redistribution sustainable with stagnation? This is the central question. If you have 3% rents of GDP coming from Pemex, but if eventually you don't, a fundamental question is how long can redistribution be there without productivity growth? So I close. Why has prosperity eluded Mexico? The technical answer is an incentive, right? The technical answer is that Mexico's labor legislation, tax legislation, markets, all this stuff here, what it does is it taxes the high productivity sector of the economy and it subsidizes the low productivity sector of the economy. So the technical answer is what's in the book. In chapter 9, what I say is, look, this comes from the 1917 revolution. This comes from ideas that people had 100 years ago about how labor should be regulated, about severance pay, about the relation between firms and workers. These ideas are deeply ingrained in el profundo del DNA of most people in Mexico, plus a political discourse that says we have to have exemptions to the value-added tax, we have to subsidize low firms, we have to give tax exemptions to small firms, And of course, we have to extend social insurance to all the informal people, taxing the formal people. That political discourse has been there for 2 decades, and the deeply ingrained things have been there. And of course, the judicial system, which reflects, I talk about this in the book, monopoly interest in a lot of them. So this is the deeper answer of what's in the book, and I'll close now. Of course, all these regulations are right. This is not a book against social policy. This is a book that says that Mexico's social policy is flawed and is not actually helping those who it's meant to support. And that if we really want to help the people that we want to help, we must change social policy to really make it work. The problem is that it's not working. And the book calls for inclusive institutions, universal rights, a whole bunch of changes which I'm not going to discuss, but is basically the message that, and this is relevant at this stage in the political transition, more of the same will not do. We've tried that for 2 decades.
I'd like to invite Ines and William back up onto the podium up here. Santiago, that was extraordinary. Please stay here. You're going to be answering questions later on. So.
Yeah, I'll take notes and then.
Okay, perfect. Too many microphones. There we go. Well, before I introduce our panelists and commentators here, let me just say that throughout your presentation, Santiago, I was receiving text messages, some as simple as "wow," some that were like that were saying that he would be an incredible professor, and some just simply saying congratulations. There you go. And some just saying congratulations to the Mexico Institute for organizing it, so thank you for making us look good. I have to say, if I had had an economics professor like you, I would have studied economics. But instead I ended up as a political economist, which is the easy way out. Congratulations, it was a terrific presentation. I'd like to recognize, before we move on, 2 people in our audience, Ambassador Tony Wayne, who I think is still here or may have stepped out, who is the co-chair of our board at the Mexico Institute, and board member Diana Negroponte. Thank you very much for being here. Let me introduce our panelists, and I'm not going to read through their biographies because you have it in front of you, I hope. But we're delighted to have with us Ines Bustillo, the director of the United Nations ECLAC, or CEPAL, Washington office, and William Maloney, chief economist, Equitable Growth Finance Institutions at the World Bank. Thank you very much for being with us. Before I ask you to give your comments, I'd just like to say that this paradox that Santiago has just presented on, this question of why doesn't Mexico grow and why isn't productivity improving, has just been this ongoing debate. In all of my time being involved with Mexico, and I arrived in Mexico in January of 1996, I heard these exact same questions, and everybody came up with a different answer sort of every few years. There was this piece that was missing, and if we could just get to the next part, then the problem would be resolved. And we heard so many different answers of structural reforms, the rule of law, big versus small firms, formal versus informal. What I really like about your book, Santiago, is that you're putting together a much more comprehensive picture. This is not a silver bullet approach, which I think is most welcome. 6 years ago, at this very institution, we were talking about the productivity problem. And Videgaray and his team had a certain set of answers for it. The political and policy agenda was formed around that argument, the Pacto por México, the reform agenda. In many cases, it was over-committed, or it made promises that it couldn't deliver. And of course, now we're paying the political price, in some ways, for that, of an incomplete diagnosis. So I'm delighted that this book provides such a comprehensive approach. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ines, if I can, and to get your reactions to this book.
Great. Well, thank you, Duncan, for the invitation to join this panel today. This was a terrific presentation, Santiago, and I enjoyed very much reading the book, and I believe it's a major contribution to understanding productivity, the challenges of productivity, and also to sound economic policy making. I'm not going to go in describing what Santiago does in the book, because he did it in a terrific way, but he raises a key question: why productivity growth in Mexico has been stagnant, I would say. And the important thing is that, and he's put his presentation in that way, he wants to understand what is going on. And I thought that was a wonderful approach that he took in the book. What is going on, and then the why, what is going on. I would like to focus just my remarks on 5 points. The first point is about methodology and data. And he explores, as you saw in the presentation, the topic of productivity in Mexico in a very careful and systematic way. And the data that he uses allows him to measure productivity at the firm level and document the existence of a large misallocation of resources. His approach is very innovative, and as I said, it's first the what and then the why. And there are many, of course, studies on productivity. Colleagues in ECLAC's Mexico office have also looked at the issue of productivity growth from a different perspective. What they have done is look at structural gaps, identifying gaps, and gaps by regions in Mexico, gaps by sector, gaps by firms, etc. And their findings are present a complementary picture of widening gaps in Mexico and a deterioration of productivity in the past years. So the data and the methodology are extremely important. It's very innovative and very carefully done. Then the second point is that the book, as you saw, is about Mexico, and the diagnosis is about policy failures behind the persistent and worsening misallocation of resources that are specific to Mexico. However, I believe that the discussion is very relevant to other Latin American countries. Productivity growth, as you know, has been also disappointing throughout the region, and the quest for high and sustained economic growth is also a challenge to other Latin American countries. I particularly found that the book discussion at the end, in the presentation you saw that Santiago talked about the LTM, and that discussion about the LTM, even though it's specific to Mexico, once again, it's very important for the region. For example, the analysis on the social insurance can be particularly relevant to countries as they examine social protection in the context of lower economic growth and also in the context of very high informality. The analysis that the book does on labor market institutions is also very interesting as well beyond Mexico. In the past years, throughout Latin America, countries have undertaken reforms, and the reforms have expressed different points of view. Some of the reforms have gone to improve labor institutions, trying to improve the flexibility of labor markets, trying to make them more efficient. Other measures have gone in the direction of protecting workers, protecting rights, etc. And obviously, there's no single best way of achieving a balance and ensuring simultaneously both efficiency as well as the protection of workers. But I think the book makes a good case that there is in fact an overlap, a large overlap in policy reforms that can contribute both to productivity and those that can improve the welfare system. I get that from the last chapters of the book. And also what I got from the book is that social policy does not need to be at odds with fostering productivity growth. And that's, I think, a very important message that should be part of the discussion. Third, I believe that the chapter on human capital was one of the most thought-provoking chapters, as you saw from the presentation today. Santiago argues that there's a large misallocation of human capital that workers acquired prior to entering the labor force. They have also very little incentives to accumulate and to acquire human capital when they are in the labor force, and the incentives also are against getting education prior to their entry into the labor force. Even though he does not touch on the book on that, I think this discussion is even more relevant in the context that we're living right now of technological progress, of automation, etc., and the challenges that workers in Mexico and workers in other Latin American countries will face as the global demand for skills shifts. And that will have definitely an impact in Mexico and in other Latin American countries. So there's, I would say, an urgent need to adopt institutional responses and improve human capital, and the book makes a contribution in that respect. Point number 4. Santiago makes a compelling case that a policy shift is necessary, and that's the word that he uses in the book. Both that is relevant to Mexico, but also for the region. Clearly, productivity must rise, and if the material conditions of Latin American countries are to improve in any lasting way. And as he says in the book, fast economic growth will not occur doing more of the same in Mexico. Of course, there's no single recipe, but he points in the direction of what to do. In our view, in addition to the direction that Santiago points to, there's also need substantial structural changes need to take place. Technological upgrading of the production structure would be key to dynamic growth, and that implies more active production sector strategies to speed up long-term growth. And my last point is that towards the end of the book, Santiago argues, and he finished with that also the presentation, that it would be necessary to gather the political support for a policy shift. And there's a need for a new narrative, a new vision, and a new vision that is necessary for Mexico, and that people will can aspire to live in a society where they believe that these changes will in fact take place. In other words, what he says at the end of the book is that there's a need for the necessary political space to challenge institutions and entrenched practices. And of course, that is not going to be easy. That is not going to be easy in Mexico, nor going to be easy in other Latin American countries, particularly at a time where we've seen a growing disconnect between institutions and citizens. In our last Latinobarometro survey, 75% of Latin Americans showed little or no confidence in their national governments, and that increased in the past years. So it's a tough moment. By the way, that's not also only the case for Latin America. It's sort of a regional phenomenon, global phenomenon. But so the political moment is not easy, but also I believe there's a good opportunity, and the book comes at a very good time. So after reading the book, I like to conclude with an element of optimism. I think that Santiago's book will definitely contribute to really an understanding of the challenges and will help to move the debate forward to create this new vision that all of Latin America needs.
Thank you, Ines, very much. William.
So, thank you very much for the invitation. Santiago and I have been tossing around some of these ideas for about 25 years now, since I was a pup working on Mexico, and I would go into his big office in Hacienda, and he would shoot apart my ideas. So this is obviously just a huge topic, not only for Mexico, and not only for our region, but for the world. Mexican TFP growth, productivity growth, has been slow over the last 10 years, perhaps zero, as he was arguing, I think. Chile's got the same problem, and China won't admit it, but they've got the same problem too. So this story can change in each situation, but all by way of saying there are a lot of people trying to look at what is driving the productivity slowdown, both globally and within our countries. Santiago's book combines his usual extraordinarily detailed knowledge of the institutionality of Mexico and the evolution of the country, which he knows from having run it, along with analytical pyrotechnics, which together yield a very compelling vision of what's going on with Mexico. The analysis of, for instance, the labor market, which is what he and I have perhaps most discussed, is, I think, right. But it's Alice in Wonderland, okay? This isn't your grandmother's informal sector where you've got, a minimum wage that's, the same as the median wage, and you've got a bunch of unhappy people there and a bunch of people who want to be formal. No. These people are indifferent often, right? And the thing is that the government has, over the course of many years, just created this enredo of incentives such that it makes more sense for big firms to keep firms off the books, for big firms not to grow, and for people to open their little firms. And all this, you have to walk through it and you have to get it in your head, but I think it's exactly the right vision. And then what he does is he links it up to the thinking around misallocation as the driver of low productivity. And that's a Sheklinau paper of about 10, 15 years ago now, where they argued that if you look at the misallocation of factors of production across the economy, you can explain something like 65% of the difference between China and the United States, and between India and the United States. And I think the book of the IDB came across, I think you mentioned it, like 50% of the difference between the United States and Colombia can be explained by misallocation, something like that. So you embed it in that kind of framework, and all of a sudden you've got a very compelling story that the misallocations caused by these well-intentioned but really terribly designed social policies, just to take one thing, can lead to very large negative impacts on productivity. So two sets of questions going into this. The first is, within that framework, how sure are we about the magnitudes and whether these particular things that he isolated are the problems driving misallocation, and whether misallocation can drive enough to get what we're getting in Mexico. And the second question is it a misallocation story? A lot or a little? Or are there other stories that we should be considering? And I want to put some of those on the table too. So the first thing is, and this, I'm going to start out, and it's going to sound really bad for Santiago, but then I'm going to bring it back and say it's good for Santiago. So the Sheklinau model has come under a lot of criticism recently, and I'll just conceptually, it rests on very strong assumptions. This mapping between dispersion of TFP and distortions requires very strict assumptions, and there are a lot of things that get left out. If your economy, for instance, is more experimental, so you have Silicon Valley people placing bets every day, you're going to have high flyers and you're going to have losers much more than an economy where nobody takes any risks, okay? Also, if you have high quality and low quality goods, you're going to have more dispersion. You have high productivity and low productivity firms, unless the theoretical underpinnings are met, you're going to have a lot of dispersion. And even worse, if you treat US data the exact same way you treat the Indian and the Chinese data, actually the United States winds up being more distorted than China and India. So that's recent work coming out of the census. So at the end of the day, does that mean this is wrong, that whole perspective? So the answer is no. It just means that the magnitudes may not be as large as we originally think in the Sheklinau, from the original Sheklinau paper. Now, why is that not necessarily really bad for Santiago? Because the same literature is saying, maybe it's not just one-off reallocation and putting all the capital in the right firms and all the labor in the right firms and everything's go. Because these distortions Santiago talk about, and he teases them out through the book, have dynamic effects in the sense that it affects what firms invest in and it affects what education people accumulate. So it's not just what Sheklinau thought, it's actually, there are dynamic effects, and these affects some simulations that actually we walk through in a book that you should check out soon called Productivity Revisited. These can have very large effects. So in this sense, Santiago's story can still hold. And we can still get large effects. It's just not going to be through a one-off sort of reallocation. If it's going to have larger, more complicated stories. Also, just in some work we did, and we don't have the numbers for Mexico, but we're working on it. If you do the disaggregations of reallocation within firm productivity growth and entry and exit, and using the most modern technology you can. In general, it's about 50% of that is within firm growth, okay? within firm productivity growth. And the reallocation component is about 25%. Again, this doesn't mean that Santiago's only got 25% going, because you can get these channels of distortions like he's got through these other channels. It just means that we have to take a step back and be a little more careful about how we're making those linkages. The second thing, staying within this model, are these the right distortions? And this paper by Jan de Locker, formerly of Princeton, shows that concentration is rising globally. And we tend to get, when you get big firms dominating the market, it becomes very hard for new firms to come in, and it becomes very hard for even a decent-sized firm who's thinking of upgrading to bother doing it, because Santiago Levy Inc. is going to eat me the minute I get, a certain size. So, I mean, Mexico's a very concentrated economy. And he wrote an excellent book a couple of years ago with Isabel Guerrero and Mike Walton, where, and there was a fantastic paper, and they said, Mexico's got incredibly distorted telecommunications sector, so prices are incredibly high there. And it's got subsidized petroleum, so prices are way below market price. So we have the perfect economy for a 20th century industrialization miracle. Problem is, we're in the 21st century, right? So if you want to industrialize and have a huge steel complex, fantastic. You want to be in telecommunications, you want to be on the cutting edge, you got totally the wrong factor prices. But that's not a problem with the labor legislation. That's a problem of very big firms. So that, you have to hold that within this model of distortions that he's gotten misallocation, we have to keep that as an alternative hypothesis to the social issues and other ones he's talking about at the end there. Okay. Now, just to take it outside the model for a second, we can broadly divide the world into, and this is crude, but folks who focus mostly on misallocation and distortions around it, and this goes for Shen Klenow and includes the doing business indicators from the World Bank and all this, and other folks who say, why aren't my firms learning faster? Let's just abstract. I mean, the Korean economy is not a miracle of growth. It was not a miracle of transparency and clean labor legislation. Nor was the Japanese economy, nor was the Taiwanese economy. So there's a whole school of literature that said, look, there's a lot just that goes on with learning within firms, right? Why is it that Mexican firms aren't learning the way Korean firms did? Hewlett-Packard and IBM started in Guadalajara the same time that the Koreans started assembling electronics. But Mexico doesn't have a teléfono azteca. They don't have one of these. The Koreans do. And so I sit back and I say, why isn't Guadalajara the back office of Silicon Valley? You had major firms there. You have the Tec de Monterrey there. What is going on that this thing didn't despegar? And then I come back, is it really the labor legislation? Or is it these distortions at the margin between small and big firms? No, these are big firms that somehow we didn't get spin-off, somehow we didn't get the kind of energy around those nuclei that might have really put Guadalajara on the map. And I agree with everything Santiago says, and I think that's part of the story. But I also wonder about this part, because I'm less convinced that that's a story purely of misallocation and distortion. I think there's something about the Mexican government saw those firms as sources of jobs and sources of taxes. And the Asians think of them as sources of learning. And I think there's something in that story that we have to consider as well as this while going on. All that said, this is the usual discussion Santiago and I have had over 25 years, and he will box my ears again, I'm sure. But it's an excellent work, and it just brings together his argument in a very thoughtful and well-defended way. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, William. Santiago, will you join us again? Thank you. I'd like to give Santiago an opportunity to respond, obviously, to the comments from Ines and William. I have a couple of very small questions that arose while I was listening to your presentation. Well, one is a comment, the other one is a question. The first one is that this churning of businesses, of the number of businesses that are dying and being reinvented, it does suggest that there's no absence of entrepreneurship in Mexico. It suggests that, as many of us have observed anecdotally, Mexicans are extraordinarily entrepreneurial, that they take risks, that they're willing to go out there and invest their own capital, time, resources into businesses, which I think is an extraordinary thing. But the question that was really nagging at me was, you'd mentioned that a lot of these larger firms die. Why is that happening? If they're much more productive, if they're efficient, are they dying? Are they merging into other firms? Are they being bought out? Well, what's actually going on there? So I add that to the comments from Ines and William, and I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience to open us up. And so we've got 2 questions right here, and then I'll take 2 more questions down there to begin. So these 2 kind people down here, if we can begin with Diana, and then yes, great.
Santiago, Diana Negroponte from Woodrow Wilson, thank you. It is truly provocative what you are bringing. I had assumed that the role of bankruptcy and Chapter 11 played a far greater role in the willingness of entrepreneurs to take risk. What role does that play in your model?
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz. I'm retired. When I was in Africa, in a small country that had very low, if any, economic growth, the principal factor was corruption. If anybody got any kind of money in any way, somebody took it away, and there was little or no legal recourse. And so there was absolutely no incentive to produce, and nobody produced. Does this play any effect in your study?
Thank you very much. So let's begin with those, Santiago, if you don't mind, and then we'll take 3 more questions in the second round.
So first, thank you to Ines and thank you to Bill. You want me to take the questions there and then come back to Ines and
As
Bill?
you wish.
Yeah, maybe I do that. You're right. I mean, the data doesn't say that there's absence of entrepreneurship. In fact, what I argue is that there's too much entrepreneurship. A lot of people that, given their talent and their abilities, would probably be more productive if they work for a firm, because they cannot get a productive job, end up making their own little, in Mexican slang, changarrito, which is just a waste of their savings and a waste of their talent, so that there's excessive entrepreneurship, right? We always have in mind there's a Steve Jobs hidden in every garage, and it's just a question of he's going to, emerge immediately. But most are not Steve Jobs. Most of these guys would be much better off working with a firm, and they're not. But as I say in the book, they rather manage their own unproductive firm than work for somebody else's unproductive firm. Right? So I don't know, I didn't show data. What I say is productive firms die. They not necessarily have to be large.
Okay.
So they can be firms that are, 7, 10 workers, 12 workers. They're the sort of firms that we would like them to see take off. And what we see is that those firms die. The very large firms don't die. And on Diana's question, the answer is I don't know. Because I don't know, when I see firms dying in my data, I don't know what is the reason behind that firm dying, whether it was bankruptcy, whether the firm decided to close down voluntarily, whether it was taken over by some other firm. I don't know that. What matters to me is that firms that should continue in the market don't, they die, and firms that should not continue in the market because they're unproductive somehow manage to survive. Most likely, bankruptcy legislation, when I spoke about LTM, my M, I very quickly referred to contract enforcement. I would encompass bankruptcy legislation in how contracts of those sort are enforced. And that's yet part of the problematic. So I would add that to that. In a similar way, I have no data on corruption. And I have no data, for instance, on something else which I think, at least in the latter years, is probably playing a role, which is security. There's another tax emerging in Mexico on firm size, which is mafias. So if you're a really small firm, you don't pay that kind of tax. But if you're beginning to be slightly, there's another tax there. There's no data. There's a Woodrow Wilson paper.
Yes.
By Viridiana.
By Rios, yes.
Yeah, there's a paper which I quote in the book of showing that in fact firms' choices are beginning to be affected by security, corruption issues. But it's very difficult to match that data with the census data. So yes, it's part of the problem, but without it, you would still have these results.
Thank you.
In the 98 census, you still have these results, and it's probably less than it's here. Let me just make a quick comment on a point made by Bill. Bill is quite right by saying, look, there's a story embedded in what I'm telling, but there's another story that could also be consistent with little productivity growth. And so 2 points for Bill. One is they're complementary. They're not mutually exclusive. But what I try to argue in the book is the pattern of distortions is not stochastic. It's not random. It is always in a particular direction. So it is my job to explain why is it that firms with non-salaried contracts are favored. And it's hard for me to say that's because of telecommunications legislation, that's because of energy legislation, or that's because of, right? There's something in the incentive structure that says don't hire salaried workers legally. And there's something in the incentive structure that says stay small. Mm-hmm. And I don't get that from the energy telecommunication. That said, monopoly behavior and sort of the rent-seeking type that Bill has in mind, and we both co-wrote a chapter in this book that he was mentioning on monopoly in Mexico a few years ago. It certainly adds to all this, and certainly is part of the ills that I would like to fix. What I didn't focus is, nobody thinks of monopoly as a social inclusion growth kind of thing. The focus of the book was the dilemma of the Mexican state that is pursuing social inclusion through policies that are impeding growth. That's without saying there are other policies that would also help growth. It's pulling attention to the fact, which is about to happen now, of adding more and adding more and adding more, like a person who's trying to stop his thirst having seawater.
Thank you. So we have a large number of questions. So I know there are two over here, so if you don't mind dealing with the young lady at the back there, and then the gentleman in front, and then I'll come to you, and then I've got Andrew, and so we're going to have 5 questions, Santiago.
Sure.
You have to answer them all in about 10 seconds each. Okay?
Well, thank you so much for your enlightening presentation and your book. My question, I'm a Colombian and Swiss national. I was working at the IDB in the Environmental and Social Safeguards Unit. And my question is the following, because your focus on social inclusion is very interesting to me, because I was born in Colombia, but I left my country when I was 12 years old. And in Switzerland, you see that they put the emphasis a lot in the fact that not everybody needs to have a master's and a PhD, but we also need people. So basically, when you're 12 years old, they can redirect you in specific schools that you can learn specific tools like plumbing, or even people who work in the back offices of banks, but they were directed since a young age. And then at some point, they can also do a higher level education, even if it's not the same universities of the people who follow high school and bachelor diplomas. So me, when I speak about this with my Colombian friends that I grew up in the French International School, it's very difficult for them to understand the fact that not everybody needs to be the president, or not everybody needs to be a CEO, or not everybody needs to do a PhD, because we also need to emphasize and really not denigrate the fact that we need the labor, the handwork, like the plumbing or the gardeners. And in countries like the US and in Europe, a lot of these, it's still very well paid. So my question is, how do you deal, because it's also social inclusion, but it's the culture. So even the taxi driver in Colombia, I know he just will go out of his way to pay the education, even if we don't have proper public education. They will pay off universities like Los Andes, which have very high rates. And then because they think the only way for them to move out of their humble beginnings is through education. But when we should also focus on the fact that if we actually saw the importance of hard worker, like plumbers or drivers or even the person who helps us, then if we would work in educating them about that power, that importance, that would also, I think, merge into the whole social inclusion, because if we wouldn't denigrate people who are also working with us, then...
So your question is about sort of the skills needed in society and differential rewards.
Yeah, but also about the impact in culture, because it's not just, even if I go, everybody I know in Colombia wants to have a PhD. They don't even think about the fact, because I don't know how many generations you need to change this mindset that you already have in countries like Switzerland, where I've seen.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. I wonder if you can pass the microphone forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Santiago. Thank you very much for your presentation. So my
Could you
question.
introduce yourself? Sorry.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So my question is related about.
Could you give us your name? Sorry.
Sorry. My question is related about innovation and technology. Sergio.
Welcome, Sergio.
Thank you. Sergio Juarez from the IDB. So my question is more related about innovation and technology as the drivers of productivity. So in the last 20, 30 years, we have seen most of the most productive countries in the world leading on innovation and technology, Korea, Germany, China, etc. So there are a lot of also indexes that says that, for example, those countries that invest more on research and development are the ones that are the most with the highest growth. Relating this to the book is this misallocation of resources and grown policy, public policy in Mexico preventing of small and medium enterprise in adopting technology and innovation in order to grow? So that's my question.
Thank you. We have a question here just behind the pillar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Santiago. I'm Veronica Michel. I'm an analyst at the World Bank. And my question is related to, your analysis points at a correlation between productivity and the formality condition. And you define formality based on this contractual relationship between a salaried worker and the employer. So I would like to understand what is it exactly behind this contractual relationship that results in this higher productivity. And bearing this question in mind, I would like to bring in as well the main messages of the World Development Report from 2019 that the World Bank will produce. It's on the future of work, which says that the nature of the world of work is changing, and more we will see less salaried jobs in the world, right? And in this industrialized economies the most. So bringing in again the question, I would like to say whether, so in this context, I guess pushing for policies that create more salaried jobs might seem out of place in this new world, right? So I would like to understand whether so what's intrinsically in these contractual relationships that brings higher productivity, and can these conditions or characteristics be replicated into more flexible forms of work so that we can come out of the right policies?
Thank you. And then if you don't mind passing the microphone back there to Andrew Seeley, and then gentleman behind him. Yeah. Sorry, could you pass the microphone to
yes, I had a question as well.
Yeah, do you mind? We'll come back to you. Thank you.
Andrew Seeley from Migration Policy Institute. Good to see you, Santiago, and great presentation. Two very quick questions. I mean, is this just a Mexican story, or is this part of a larger Latin American story? How different is Mexico from other countries in the region? I imagine the answer is yes, but why is Mexico different? And two, how do you get from here to there? Since Mexico has built this sort of giant safety net around non-employment-based social programs, how do you move to something that creates different incentives without leaving people unprotected?
Thank you. Gentleman behind you. There you go. Yep.
Oh, hi. I'm Carlos Galina. I'm a grad student at GW. And the question I had is focused more on the Mexican government, in the sense that I think that it finds itself in a dual position in the way that it has cozied up to these top 10 businesses that have created a kind of monopoly, and it has also created in this informal market clienteles that are that have given voting results every election. So how can the Mexican government break through or find the midpoint where it finds the incentives for big businesses to continue growing, and also for a more inclusive growth that breaks these clienteles as well?
Thank you. And our last bonus question here from the invisible lady behind the
Marisela Ponsalon from the IDB. So my question is, do you have data, or have you considered data in your study of also the impact that that unintentional injuries have on labor, like drowning falls, burns, road traffic injuries, especially if we consider that in productivity and the social insurance inefficiency, and especially when we consider that in Mexico there is around 16,000 or 24,000 people that die in this kind of injuries, and that it costs to countries between 2 to 3 or even 5% of the GDP on road traffic injuries particularly.
I don't want you to end on that question because that'll leave us all feeling depressed, okay? So we'll end on an high note.
So thank you, everybody, for the question. So your question is very broad, but Switzerland, Germany, Austria, they have developed over many years this alternative dual degree, dual track education. And there's a lot to be learned from them. And yes, there's some cultural impediments from the region to adapt it, but it's partly related also to the fact that they're firms that are very organized, that have a long-term interest in the formation of workers' human capital. And there are not that many firms in Mexico that have that interest. So it's kind of endogenous to the fact that the firm structure is sort of distorted. So Sergio's questions on innovation. I have nothing against innovation, and you know, there are certainly gains to be had from entrepreneurship programs. I'm not arguing against any of that. The only thing I have in my head is the figure of Penelope. We can do a lot on innovation programs. We can do a lot of entrepreneurship programs. We can do a lot on training. We've done a lot. More could be done. But it's like Alice in Wonderland. We have to keep on running to stay in the same, you know. At the other side, we waste those gains. We would get more and more rewards if we didn't undermine those efforts by the other policies that I'm doing here. The problem is that we undermine them. So Veronica's question. Ideally, what you would like is to protect workers regardless of how you label them, salaried, non-salaried, self-employed, rural, urban, male, female. Ideally, what you would like is for all workers to be protected from risks, death, illness, disability, from loss of job, to have some basic income, independently of what they do. I have no preference ex ante for salaried work, non-salaried work, self-employed. The problem in Mexico is that one is taxed and the other one is subsidized, and that's what creates the problem. But otherwise, in principle, firms should be able to choose whatever form of contract is best for them. Workers should be able to choose whatever. And then, as technology evolves, the contract structure changes, and that's fine. And robots come, you know, all this will be very dynamic. I didn't speak, as Bill mentioned this, I didn't speak at all, Inez mentioned this, I didn't speak at all about technical change and robotics. Under this structure, it'll all make it worse. If it was already dysfunctional, it's going to make it even more dysfunctional. So that's practically what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to separate those two things. So Andrew, Inez mentioned this a little bit. Peru, in some respects, institutionally and legally, doesn't differ that much from Mexico. The definitions of what is salaried, non-salaried, who's obligated and who's not obligated vary a little bit from country to country. The self-employed in Peru are treated differently from the dependent workers. So there are institutional nuances, but the broad strokes of a welfare state deeply anchored in Bismarck, which is increasingly relevant to the reality of the region, is shared by Colombia, by Peru, by Ecuador, by the Central America, and they're all struggling. Why is it in Mexico more pronounced than in other countries? Because everything in Mexico is kind of deeper. Because if other countries spend 0.5% of GDP on non-contributory programs, in Mexico we spend 1.8% of GDP. Because in other countries the taxes for firms have a difference of this much, in Mexico the difference is this much. Mexico is a particularly good lab from the point of view of taking the extremes of policies that are present in many Latin American countries, and that also, if you go back to my Penelope picture, the red arrows and the green arrows, the red arrows are smaller in other countries and the green arrows are bigger, and that's why they grow a little bit more than Mexico. In Mexico, the red arrows are bigger because we've pursued social inclusion through the wrong means faster. The here to there is a much fundamental question. The book says, 6 years ago I wrote a paper on the here to there, but I expressly didn't want to put it into this book, because the purpose of this book was just saying, look, let's rethink. Let's not do more of the same because it's not going to work. Let's have an image of what is the sort of social the welfare state that we would like to have, and I sketch universal rights. But the problem with economists is that then they begin to talk about the details. And they begin to fight about, the 0.5% or 2%. And I made that mistake 6 years ago. I made a big proposal for universal social rights, and I made the mistake of putting numbers. And the whole discussion was deviated about 0.5% of GDP. We're talking about numbers that are much bigger than that. So what I'm trying to do right now is to say, look, let's agree that this doesn't work. Let's not do more of it. And then let's have a debate as to how we can get to a better alternative. But if I can get the message right now, more of the same will not work, I'll be super happy. On Carlos' question, I'm not sure I got it. But, Bill made some points about more competition, and that sort of thing is certainly part of things that are welcome. I didn't speak at all about that in my presentation. In the book, there's a discussion, when I talk about market conditions, there's a discussion about monopolies. There's a discussion about monopolies, how they misallocate credit, and how this is also a reason why firms can't grow, because they don't have access to credit. So changing all these market conditions is good. I don't put a lot of emphasis on that because nobody disagrees with that. We all agree that we don't like monopolies. We all agree that we would like more credit. So that's fine. The things I focused on more were the things that I think there's less agreement. And lastly, on Maricela's question, I don't have any data on disability. It is a problem in the way that, just 30 seconds this. If you think about the way social insurance works in Mexico, suppose I came to you and I say, I'm going to sell you house insurance. And your house insurance will cover your house against fire or flood during the winter and the fall. But in the spring, it will not cover it. That's not very good insurance, right? Or if I insure your car on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but I don't insure your car on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Social insurance in Mexico insures workers Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Because all this firm churning implies that workers sometimes are formal and sometimes are informal. We tend to think of formal workers and informal workers. This is a misnomer. It's much better to say when workers are formally employed and when the same individual with the same human capital and the same education is informally employed. And then again formally employed, and then informally employed. And we have the data for the labor trajectories of individuals that go back and forth between the formal sector and the informal sector. Sometimes they're insured against disability, sometimes they're not insured against disability. If they lose an arm when they're formally employed, they're going to get a disability pension. If they lose an arm when they're informally employed, they're not going to get a disability pension. If the woman is pregnant and she's formally employed, she's going to get a child allowance. If the woman is pregnant and she's informally employed, she's not going to get the child allowance. It's the same woman with the same education and the same effort. This is Mexico's social insurance system. And it's not very effective.
Thank you, Santiago. Ines, William, would you like to make any final comments?
Well, I think from the discussion that we had, it's clear that this is a major contribution. And it's clear that there's a need for a policy shift. And that requires a diagnosis, and the contribution of Santiago is towards the right diagnosis. But the policy shift will not only, I believe, not only include an analysis of the misallocation of resources and dealing with those, the right incentives, but also at some point there's a need in Mexico and Latin America for technological upgrading and uptake production policy. That will be key for long-term lasting economic growth.
Thank you. William.
I guess, just to be clear, I think we're 100% in agreement on your diagnostic. It's just a question of is this 90% of the problem or 10% of the problem? And that's what I can't tell yet. And we've had this discussion before. I mean, I absolutely agree that the social protection system in Mexico and throughout Latin America doesn't serve workers, both in the short run or the long run, for the reasons that you're discussing. So I totally agree with that. It's just a question, if I'm going to send AMLO tilting against windmills, which windmills do I want him to tilt against? And I absolutely agree that this ought to be on the agenda, and over the long run, we have to think totally different and change the chip, as you say. It's just a question of, is this the windmill or a windmill?
Well, stay tuned, everybody, because when William works out the answer to that question, we're going to have him back along with Ines and Santiago for another presentation. But at this point in time, let me just thank all of our panelists, but especially you, Santiago. Thank you very, very much for being here with us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Please give a round of applause.